I used to laugh whenever people talked about the unseen world. If someone claimed they had experienced something they could not explain, I would politely nod and then change the subject, because I preferred things I could measure, touch, or prove. Looking back, I realized that certainty made life feel comfortable. It let me dismiss questions that had no easy answers. That confidence began to change after a series of strange moments that, taken one by one, could have been explained away, but together forced me to pay attention to parts of life I had ignored. It started with a quiet dinner at a sidewalk restaurant after work. The place was crowded, filled with smoke, loud conversations, and the clatter of dishes. As my friends joked around, I noticed an elderly woman sitting alone near the edge of the tables. She wore worn clothing and stared intently at the scraps people left behind. I assumed she was hungry and offered to buy her a meal, but when I turned to point her out, she was gone. One of my friends insisted no one had been sitting there at all. I laughed it off, yet for some reason, the image stayed with me. Over the following weeks, I became unusually aware of small things that other people ignored. I saw exhausted workers hiding tears before walking into their homes, children pretending not to notice arguments between their parents, and lonely neighbors who stood at their windows every evening just watching strangers pass by. None of these moments were supernatural, but they made me wonder how much suffering exists just outside our attention. Around the same time, I visited an older relative who believed deeply in traditions about the invisible side of life. We drank tea, while rain tapped softly against the roof. Without trying to convince me of anything, the relative simply said that some people spend their lives acting as though every selfish decision disappears the moment it is made. But consequences often linger in ways no one expects. I challenged the idea, asking whether anyone could truly know what happens beyond ordinary sight. The answer surprised me. The relative smiled and admitted not knowing for certain, then said that uncertainty itself should make us more careful rather than less. That conversation followed me home. Soon afterward, I found myself noticing my own habits. I would complain impatiently to strangers, leave food unfinished without thinking, and speak harshly when stressed, because I assumed the moment would pass and be forgotten. Yet once I started paying attention, I realized those moments did not vanish. They remained in people's expressions, in awkward silences, and in my own memory long after I wanted to move on. One evening after drinking too much with coworkers, I stumbled outside and became sick beside a tree before calling a ride home. The next morning, embarrassment hit me harder than the headache, because I remembered a cleaner arriving before sunrise and silently washing away the mess while everyone else hurried by. I apologized when I saw him again days later, expecting annoyance, but he simply shrugged and accepted it with surprising kindness. That exchange unsettled me, because his quiet patience made my careless behavior impossible to excuse. As months passed, dreams began visiting me with unusual clarity. They never felt like predictions or revelations, only symbolic scenes my mind seemed determined to replay. In one dream, crowded streets were filled with invisible burdens carried on people's backs, while they smiled and pretended everything was fine. In another, abandoned animals waited silently behind market stalls, not accusing anyone, but simply existing as reminders that every action leaves traces beyond the moment itself. I never woke believing those dreams represented literal reality, but I could not ignore the emotions they stirred. They encouraged me to look beyond appearances. At work, I noticed a colleague whose temper seemed to worsen every week. Others mocked him behind his back, yet one afternoon I discovered him sitting alone in the parking area with his face in his hands. He confessed that his marriage was collapsing, and he barely slept anymore. I remembered how quickly I had judged him, and felt ashamed. It struck me that people often carry invisible weight that outsiders never recognize. My perspective shifted further after volunteering at a hospital through a community program. Walking through waiting rooms, I saw anxious families clutching paperwork. exhausted nurses moving from room to room, and patients staring quietly at ceilings while machines beeped nearby. Nothing mystical occurred there, but the concentration of grief, hope, fear, and love was overwhelming. Leaving the building one evening, I realized the world contains countless stories unfolding simultaneously, many hidden from casual observers. After that, my behavior changed in subtle ways. I became more careful about speaking impatiently, more willing to help without expecting recognition, and more conscious of waste. Friends teased me for becoming unusually considerate. One even joked that I had started believing invisible judges were following me everywhere. I laughed, but I also understood what had really changed. I no longer needed certainty about unseen things to appreciate that unseen consequences are real. Hurt feelings cannot be photographed. Regret has no physical shape. Kindness leaves no visible trail through the air. Yet all of them alter lives. The moment that affected me most happened during a family gathering when someone made fun of an elderly neighbor who collected leftovers after celebrations. People laughed and called the habit strange. Without thinking, I packed untouched food into containers and brought them outside. The neighbor accepted them with gratitude so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the sounds of traffic. On the walk back inside, I felt no sense of heroism, only discomfort at how close I had come to joining the laughter instead. Later that night, I sat alone listening to distant rain and thought about the stories I had dismissed for years. Whether tales of wandering spirits, unseen companions, or mysterious visions were literally true, seemed less important than the questions they asked of the living. If I believed every careless action ended with me, I would probably continue acting carelessly. If I accepted that my choices echoed into the lives of others in ways I might never witness, then paying attention became a responsibility rather than an inconvenience. I cannot honestly say I have seen ghosts drifting through rooms, or strange beings gathering where people eat, or invisible figures following strangers through crowded intersections. What I can say is that once I began looking beyond the surface, I found evidence everywhere that hidden burdens exist. Some were emotional, some physical, some moral, and some belonged to memories people carried alone. The world did not become frightening, it became humbling. I still pass busy restaurants, crowded markets, hospitals, intersections, and quiet parks, and I often wonder how many silent stories surround me that I will never fully understand. That thought no longer fills me with fear. Instead, it reminds me to leave places cleaner than I found them, to treat people with patience before judgment, to avoid causing unnecessary harm even when no one is watching, and to remember that the smallest actions can become part of someone else's unseen struggle. Years after those first unsettling experiences, I no longer argue with people who believe differently from me because I have learned that certainty is easier than compassion. I simply carry on with a little more care than I once did, and every now and then, when I notice someone quietly bearing a weight the rest of the world has overlooked, I think back to the season when I started paying attention and realize that perhaps the most important things I ever learned were never about seeing another world at all, but about finally noticing the one that had been right in front of me the entire time.